On the 7th of October, 1856, the wind came down off the Ozark ridges, carrying the smell of dying leaves and something colder behind it. Silas Farrow stood in the yard of his father's homestead outside Yellville, Arkansas, holding a canvas sack that contained everything his family had decided he was worth: a hand plane with a cracked sole, a wool blanket worn to gauze at the corners, a copy of Lyell's Principles of Geology missing its back cover, and 3 silver dollars. The coins had been his mother's. Everything else in the house, all 40 acres, the livestock, the cured tobacco drying in the barn, the good iron stove, the oak table where 4 generations of Farrows had eaten their meals, that went to his brothers. His eldest brother, Orrin, stood on the porch with his arms folded across a chest that had grown thick with age and self-regard. Beside him, Gerald, the middle son, looked at the ground and said nothing. Gerald had always been the quiet one, the one who followed Orrin's lead, not out of agreement, but out of an exhaustion that passed for loyalty. Orrin's wife, Letitia, watched from behind the window glass with a thin smile she didn't bother to hide. She had campaigned for this outcome for 3 years, ever since the old man's health began to fail, and she wore her victory the way some women wear new jewelry, conspicuously. "You got what's fair," Orrin said. His voice had the flat certainty of a man who has practiced his justification until it no longer sounds like one. Pa always said the land goes to the ones who work it. Silas had worked it. He'd worked it since he was 9 years old, the same year their mother died of consumption and their father started disappearing into whiskey for weeks at a time, leaving 3 boys to tend 40 acres of rocky hillside and keep themselves fed. Silas had plowed and planted and split rails and mended fences alongside his brothers every season, but he was the youngest. He was the one who read books by candle stub instead of playing cards after dark. He was the one who collected rocks and pressed leaves between the pages of old almanacs, who asked questions about why the creek froze in certain spots before others, who once spent an entire Sunday afternoon watching a spider build a web instead of attending church. In Orrin's estimation, and in Letitia's, that made him something less than a real son of the family. A dreamer. A waste. "You'll be fine," Gerald muttered, still not looking up. His voice carried the particular heaviness of a man who knows he's doing wrong and lacks the spine to do otherwise. "You're clever." Silas looked at the house he'd been born in 28 years ago. He looked at the porch where his mother had sat shelling beans in the last summer of her life. He looked at the hand plane and the $3. He picked up his sack, settled the strap across his shoulder, and walked south without saying a word, because words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him that he could still call his. He walked for 2 days, following the old game trails that wound along the ridgelines and down through hollows where the water ran clear over beds of gravel and limestone. He slept the first night under a rock overhang near Bear Creek, wrapped in his thin blanket, listening to the creek talk to itself in the darkness. He ate nothing. He had no food. The $3 were for survival, not comfort, and he would not spend them on the road when he didn't yet know where the road was leading. The Ozarks in autumn were a kind of cathedral. Limestone bluffs draped in scarlet oak and sugar maple, the hollows running with cold spring water that tasted like iron and rain. The hills rolled on in every direction, ancient and unhurried, their shapes carved by 100 million years of water working through stone. Silas knew these hills. As a boy, he'd wandered them on Sundays when his brothers were sleeping off Saturday night and his father was beyond waking. He'd mapped creek beds in his mind, traced the veins of flint and chert that ran through the exposed rock faces, sat for hours beside springs watching the water emerge from the earth, as if the ground itself were bleeding something clean. He understood, in the way that a person understands a language learned in childhood, that these hills were alive. The stone breathed. The water remembered. The land had been here long before the pharaohs, and would be here long after, and its patience made human quarrels look very small. On the evening of the 9th, with the temperature dropping toward freezing and the sky turning the color of a bruise above the western ridgeline, he found the cave. It was set into a south-facing bluff about 100 feet above Sugar Creek, half hidden by a curtain of Virginia creeper that had gone blood red with the season. A massive sycamore grew at an angle from the base of the bluff, its white bark glowing in the last light, like bone. The opening was wide enough for a man to walk through upright, maybe 7 feet high and 10 across, shaped like a flattened arch that nature had carved with the same patient hand that shaped everything in these hills. Silas pushed through the creeper and stepped inside. The first thing he felt was warmth. Not heat, not the blast of a fireplace or the stifle of a closed room in summer. This was something steadier, something deeper, as if the stone itself held a low and patient fire that had been burning since before anyone could remember. He set down his sack and stood there in the darkness, breathing. The air was moist and still and carried a mineral smell, clean stone, wet earth, the faintest trace of sulfur from deep underground. He could hear water somewhere far back in the passage, a slow dripping like a pulse, steady and unhurried. The temperature inside the cave, he would later estimate, was close to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it had already dropped to 40 and was still falling. In another month, those Ozark nights would plunge below zero. But in here, in this pocket of ancient stone, the earth held its warmth like a mother holding a child against the cold. Silas had read enough of Lyle to understand, at least in outline, what he was feeling. Deep caves maintained a near constant temperature year-round, regulated by the massive thermal inertia of the surrounding rock. Hundreds of feet of limestone acted as insulation, absorbing the summer's heat and releasing it slowly through winter, absorbing winter's cold and releasing it through summer. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature became. In winter, that meant warmth. In summer, it meant cool. The earth itself was a kind of furnace and a kind of icehouse both at once, depending on what you needed and when you needed it. He slept that first night on bare stone with his wool blanket pulled to his chin, listening to the cave breathe around him, that faint, steady movement of air from the depths toward the entrance, like the slow exhalation of something vast and sleeping. He did not dream of his brothers or the house he'd lost. He dreamed of nothing at all, and it was the deepest sleep he'd had in years. By the end of October, Silas had explored the cave to a depth of roughly 200 feet. The main passage ran straight back from the entrance for about 60 feet, the ceiling dropping from 7 feet to 5 before rising again as the tunnel opened into a chamber, perhaps 30 feet across and 15 high. This main chamber had a roughly oval floor, smooth in places where water had pooled and deposited minerals over millennia, rough in others where the limestone had fractured and fallen in slabs. The walls were pale gray with streaks of ochre and rust where iron deposits bled through the rock. In the ceiling, small stalactites hung in clusters, some no bigger than a finger, others as long as a man's forearm, each one the slow accumulation of thousands of years of mineral-laden water finding its patient way down through darkness. Beyond the main chamber, the cave branched into 3 smaller tunnels. The first ran northwest and dead-ended after about 40 feet in a jumble of fallen rock. The second curved east and narrowed to a crack too tight for a man's shoulders. The third, the deepest, dropped slightly as it went and continued into the hillside farther than Silas could follow in the dim light of his tallow candles. He would explore it later when he had better light. For now, he had more immediate concerns. He spent his $3 carefully, walking the 7 miles to Yellville and back in a single day. At the general store, $3 bought him 10 pounds of cornmeal, a pound of salt, a small tin of lard, a box of sulfur matches, a half-pound of tallow candles, a coil of hemp rope, a second-hand hatchet with a nick in the blade, and a tin cup. The storekeeper, a man named Hendricks, looked at Silas's worn clothes and hollow cheeks and asked if he was passing through. "Staying," Silas said, and offered nothing more. He carried it all back to the cave and set about the work of making a home. The first task was light. Working with the hatchet and a flat stone he used as a chisel, he carved shallow niches into the limestone walls at regular intervals. The stone was soft enough to work if he struck at the right angle, following the natural bedding planes, and set tallow candles in each one. When he lit them for the first time, the chamber transformed. The limestone caught the candlelight and held it, amplified it, threw it from wall to wall and ceiling to floor in a pale, warm glow that seemed to come from the stone itself. The cave became a lantern seen from the inside. The stalactites threw soft shadows that moved when the candle flames moved, as if the cave were breathing visibly. The second task was shelter within shelter. The cave's entrance, while protected by the bluff's overhang, still admitted wind and rain. The south-facing orientation meant good sunlight in winter, but also exposure to storms that blew up the creek valley. Silas spent 8 days gathering flat stones from the creek bed below, carrying them up the steep path 1 or 2 at a time, his arms burning, his boots slipping on the loose scree, and stacking them into a wall across the lower half of the opening. He mixed a crude mortar from creek mud, wood ash, and crushed limestone, working it with his hands until it reached a consistency he judged right by instinct and by the memory of watching masons work on buildings in Yellville. He packed it between the stones and let it cure in the dry cave air. The wall rose to about 4 feet, roughly 400 pounds of stone laid course by course, leaving the upper portion of the entrance open for ventilation and light. The effect was immediate and remarkable. The cave's interior temperature, which had hovered around 58 degrees, climbed to 62 within a day of the wall's completion. The stone mass trapped the earth's warmth more efficiently now that the wind couldn't steal it away. The wall also blocked the worst of the rain and created a psychological boundary. Inside was home. Outside was the world. He built a sleeping platform from cedar poles cut with the hatchet and lashed with rope, raised 18 inches off the cave floor to escape the damp that collected on the stone at night. He gathered dried leaves and meadow grass for bedding, piling it 18 inches thick and covering it with his blanket. He fashioned a door for the entrance from woven branches and cedar bark, hinged on rope loops, that could be swung open in mild weather and pulled closed and tied when the wind came howling up the creek. He built a simple hearth near the entrance from flat stones, not for heating, the cave provided that, but for cooking. The smoke drew out through the open upper portion of the entrance wall, and on still nights when it didn't draw well, he cooked outside on the ledge. By the first week of November, 1856, Silas Farrow was living in a cave with a stone wall, a cedar bed, candlelight, a cooking hearth, and a near-constant temperature that most houses in Yellville couldn't match with a cord of firewood and a Franklin stove. He'd spent $3. He was, by any honest measure, comfortable. The town, of course, thought he was insane. Word traveled the way it always does in small places, through the barber, the general store, the church pews where Silas no longer appeared on Sundays, the fence lines where neighbors leaned and exchanged news with the slow relish of people who have little entertainment and unlimited appetite for it. Orrin's wife, Letitia, was particularly generous with the story. The youngest Pharaoh boy, she told anyone who'd listen, had gone to live in a hole in the ground like a badger, turned out of the house. She never said cast out, never said cheated, always turned out, as if Silas had left voluntarily, with $3 and too proud to beg, too strange to find honest work, and now scrabbling around in the dirt somewhere up Sugar Creek, eating roots and talking to himself. It was a shame, she said, in a voice that contained no shame at all, only the bright satisfaction of a prophecy confirmed. Some people pitied him. Old Mrs. Whitaker, who had known his mother, left a bundle of dried venison and 2 sweet potatoes at the base of the bluff trail one November morning without climbing up. A farmer named Jessup McCullen, who lived 3 miles down the creek, offered Silas winter work-splitting rails, which Silas declined, politely but firmly. He had work to do. Through November and into December, with the days growing shorter and the cold deepening, he improved the cave systematically, applying the same patient observation that had once driven his brothers to mockery. He noticed that the deeper chambers were warmer than the entrance, and that the air moved, a faint, steady current flowing from the back of the cave toward the mouth. On cold nights, he could feel it on his face, a gentle exhalation of warm air from the stone depths. On the rare warm day, the current reversed, drawing cooler outside air inward. He was feeling what geologists would later call cave breathing, the natural convection caused by temperature differences between the cave's interior and the outside air. In winter, warm air inside the cave rose and flowed outward through upper passages and cracks, pulling cooler air in through lower openings. The cave was a chimney, drawing air through itself in a slow, perpetual cycle. The principle was the same one that made a fireplace draw. Warm air rises, creating a current. But the cave did it without fire, using only the stored heat of the earth. If he could control that airflow, he reasoned, he could regulate the temperature of his living space with the precision of a man adjusting a damper on a stove. He experimented. Using flat stones and mud mortar, he built a low wall across one of the deeper tunnels, leaving a gap at the bottom, roughly the size of a man's fist. The wall acted as a baffle, slowing the airflow and trapping warm air in the main chamber. Within a day, the temperature climbed from 62 to 65 degrees. He built another baffle in the second tunnel, 68 degrees. He stuffed moss and dried grass into cracks in the ceiling, where he could feel cold air seeping through from above, tiny passages where the cave's breathing leaked heat to the outside. With each crack sealed, the temperature climbed another degree or half degree. By Christmas of 1856, with snow 3 inches deep on the ground outside and the temperature at 14 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest night, the interior of Silas Pharaoh's main chamber held steady at 71 degrees. He had no fireplace heating the space. He burned no wood for warmth. The earth itself warmed him, and all he'd done was learn to listen to it and work with what it offered. He recorded his observations in a notebook made from folded brown paper, using a pencil stub he'd found on the road near Yellville. The entries were precise and methodical. Dates, temperatures estimated by the behavior of water and breath, and the feel of stone under his palm, wind directions, descriptions of the cave's behavior in different weather conditions, sketches of his baffling arrangements. He was not a scientist in any formal sense. He had no degree, no instruments, no training beyond his single battered volume of Lyle. But he had a scientist's instinct, the bone-deep belief that the world was knowable if you paid attention and wrote down what you saw. The first winter was hard in other ways. He ate simply, and sometimes not enough. Cornmeal mush thickened with lard, wild game when he could get it with snares made from hemp rope, dried persimmons, and black walnuts gathered in the last warm days of autumn and stored in a cool side tunnel. He lost weight. His clothes hung looser by the week. His hands cracked and bled from the constant work with stone and wood. The skin split along the knuckles where cold and labor conspired against healing. There were nights when the loneliness settled on him like a physical weight, pressing him into his cedar bed, and the cave's silence became not peaceful, but oppressive, a reminder that he was one man, alone, in a hole in a hillside, and that no one in the world particularly cared whether he lived or died. On those nights, the dripping of water in the dark sounded less like a heartbeat and more like a clock counting down. But mornings came. They always did. And each morning he woke warm, in a shelter he'd built with his own two bleeding hands, and the wondering stopped. He made coffee when he had it, and cornmeal mush when he didn't, and he picked up his tools and went back to work. Purpose was a stronger medicine than rest, and the cave, patient and steady around him, asked nothing of him except that he keep paying attention. Spring of 1857 arrived in the Ozarks like a slow exhalation, gradual, tentative, then suddenly everywhere at once. The dogwoods bloomed white along the creek banks. The redbud trees lit up the understory in clouds of pink, so vivid they looked painted. May apples pushed through the leaf litter on the forest floor, their umbrella leaves unfurling like small green parasols. The creek rose with snowmelt and rain, running muddy for weeks before clearing to its summer green. Silas emerged from his cave into a world that had gone on without him, and seemed none the worse for it. He'd survived the winter, more than survived. He'd thrived after a fashion. He was thinner, harder, browner from the days spent gathering wood and checking snares in the winter sun. The cave was warm, dry, and structurally sound. His mortar walls had held through freezing and thawing. His baffling system worked with a reliability that surprised even him. He had proven, at least to himself, that a man could live through an Ozark winter without burning a single stick of firewood for heating, using nothing but the earth's own warmth and a little ingenuity. Now he needed to eat regularly and to earn. He took work where he could find it that spring and summer, splitting rails for Jessup McCullen after all, helping build a bridge over Bear Creek, clearing land for new homesteads, pushing west into the Ozark interior. He was stronger than he looked, lean and tireless, and he worked without complaint from dawn until the light failed. He saved every cent he earned, spending only on cornmeal, salt, coffee beans, and the occasional luxury of a newspaper from Little Rock, which he read cover to cover and then used as fire starter. By September, he had accumulated $11.40, a considerable sum by the standards of the time and place. He spent it on tools, a proper mason's chisel, forged steel, with a good edge, a 4-pound hammer with an ash handle, a handsaw, a draw knife for shaping wood, a measuring line and a carpenter's square, a supply of proper candles, and, after long deliberation, walking back and forth in front of the shelf at Hendrick's store 3 times. A miner's lamp that burned whale oil, which threw a steady, bright light that didn't flicker and gutter the way tallow candles did. The lamp cost him $2.75, nearly a quarter of his savings, and it was worth every penny. With the lamp, he could see the cave as he'd never seen it before. The tallow candles had given him pools of amber light surrounded by deep shadow. The miner's lamp threw a beam, directed, strong, penetrating, that reached into corners and tunnels and crevices he'd passed 100 times without knowing what they held. What he saw changed everything. Deep in the back of the 3rd tunnel, past the point where he'd stopped exploring the previous autumn, past a narrow squeeze where the ceiling dropped to 4 feet and the walls pressed close enough to scrape both shoulders, the passage opened suddenly into a chamber roughly the size of a church nave. The ceiling soared to 20 feet or more, lost in shadow even with the lamp. The floor dropped away in a series of natural terraces, each one edged with stone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. And covering every surface, walls, ceiling, the fallen boulders on the floor, the terraces, the columns where stalactites and stalagmites had met and fused over millennia, were crystals. They were calcite, he would later learn. Dogtooth spar, the miners called it. Sharp-pointed crystals that grew in clusters like frozen starbursts, some clear as glass, some honey gold, some tinged with pale violet, where trace minerals had colored the calcite as it formed. They ranged in size from crystals no bigger than a grain of rice to formations as large as a man's head, complex geometric clusters that caught the lamplight and threw it back in 1,000 points, so that the chamber seemed filled with cold fire, with frozen lightning, with something that was not quite light and not quite color, but something older and more patient than either. Silas stood in the center of that room and turned slowly, watching the light move across the formations, watching each crystal face catch the flame and pass it on to its neighbor in a chain of brilliance that seemed to ripple through the stone itself. For the first time in his life, he felt something he could only describe as reverence. Not the church kind, not the Sunday morning kind, but something deeper and more honest. The feeling of standing in the presence of something vast and ancient that had no need of him and no interest in his troubles and was beautiful beyond any effort to contain it in words. He did not immediately think of money. That came later, and from someone else. What he thought, standing in that cathedral of crystal and stone, was that the earth had been building this room for 100,000 years, drop by patient drop, molecule by molecule, and he was the first human being to see it. The honor of that fact was almost more than he could hold. He told no one about the crystal chamber for nearly a year. He visited it often, sometimes daily, bringing his lamp and his brown paper notebook and spending hours mapping the formations, sketching the crystal clusters, noting which ones were actively growing. He could see the tiny beads of mineral-laden water clinging to their tips, and which had broken off from their own weight and lay scattered on the terraced floor like shattered chandeliers. He read and reread his battered copy of Lyle, matching what he saw to the descriptions of mineral deposition and cave formation, teaching himself the vocabulary of geology word by careful word. He was learning the way the cave itself had been built, slowly, from the ground up, with patience as the only essential material. It was a woman named Clara Merrick who changed the course of his solitude. Clara was the daughter of a Czech immigrant family that had settled near Yellville in 1854, part of a small wave of Central European craftsmen drawn to the Ozarks by advertisements promising good limestone and cheap land. Her father, Antonin Marek, was a stonemason by trade who'd learned his craft in Bohemia and practiced it in Prague before the upheavals of 1848 drove him and his wife across the ocean. He'd come to Arkansas chasing those advertisements and found that they were half true. The limestone was excellent, dense and fine-grained, and beautifully workable. But the cheap land came with malarial creek bottoms and summers that could kill a man who wasn't used to them. Antonine had died of fever in the summer of 1856, leaving Clara and her mother, Bozhena, to manage a half-cleared homestead, with no male relatives, little English, and the quiet desperation of women who understand exactly how precarious their situation is. Silas met Clara in April of 1858 at McCullen's farm, where she'd come to trade eggs and butter for flour. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with the kind of face that people called plain, until they looked again and realized that what they were seeing wasn't plainness, but intensity. A face arranged not for beauty, but for attention, for seeing things clearly and not flinching from what it saw. When McCullen's wife offered her a basket of charity food along with the flour, Clara declined politely and asked instead if there was any stonework that needed doing. She'd learned masonry from her father. She could point-dress limestone and lay a wall as true as any man in the county. McCullen's wife looked uncomfortable. Silas, who was eating his lunch on a stump nearby, cornbread and cold venison, looked up and said, "You know how to read stone?" Clara turned to him. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they assessed him with the quick thoroughness of a woman who has learned to judge people accurately because her survival depends on it. "I know how to read everything," she said. "My father taught me." That was the beginning. They talked, at first cautiously, and then with increasing freedom and pleasure, about stone and mortar and the properties of limestone in different weathers. Clara knew things Silas didn't. Proper mortaring techniques from the European tradition, how to dress stone faces for water shedding so that rain ran off instead of soaking in, the chemistry of quickite and hydraulic cement that set even in wet conditions, the difference between ashlar and rubble masonry, and when each was appropriate. Her father had taught her not just the practice, but the theory, the why behind the how, and she spoke of stone with the easy authority of someone who had been raised in the language. Silas knew things Clara didn't: the cave, the crystals, the breathing of the earth, the thermal properties of deep stone, the behavior of underground water. Within a month, he'd brought her to see the cave. He watched her face as she entered the main chamber, as she ran her hand along the mortar joints of his entrance wall, and shook her head slightly. Not criticism exactly, more the instinctive response of a trained mason seeing amateur work. She looked at the baffling system with genuine curiosity, asking questions about airflow and temperature that showed she understood the principles even before he explained them. Within 2 months, she was helping him rebuild the entrance wall with properly dressed limestone. Each stone faced on 4 sides, the joints tight and pointed with a mortar mix she prepared herself from Portland cement she'd brought from her father's remaining supplies, mixed with sand and lime in proportions she knew by heart. The new wall was a revelation. Where Silas's original had been rough and serviceable, Clara's was precise and beautiful, courses running level, joints uniform, the stone faces smooth and angled to shed water. It was the difference between shelter and architecture. She did not gush over the crystal chamber when he finally showed it to her, though he could see the lamplight reflecting in her eyes as she stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, the way he had turned the first time. She walked the perimeter in silence, touching nothing, studying the formations the way her father had taught her to study a building site, with patience, respect, and the understanding that the first job is always to see clearly before you act. "These are worth money," she said finally, her voice matter of fact. "You know that." "I know," Silas said, "but that's not why you showed me." "No." She nodded, and that was enough. They understood each other in the way that two people sometimes do, not through grand declarations or dramatic revelations, but through a shared vocabulary of attention, a mutual recognition that they saw the world the same way. Carefully, patiently, with respect for what was actually there, rather than what they wished to see. It was Clara who suggested showing the crystals to Professor Elihu Washburn, a geologist from the State Survey Office in Little Rock, who passed through the Ozark counties every spring and fall, cataloging mineral deposits, mapping rock formations, and collecting specimens for the state's fledgling geological archive. Washburn was a Boston-educated man with mutton-chop whiskers, wire-rimmed spectacles, and a habit of speaking in technical language that he forgot to simplify for audiences who hadn't read the same journals he had. He arrived at the base of the bluff on a warm September morning in 1858, already skeptical. He'd been told by the postmaster in Yellville that a hermit cave dweller had found some pretty rocks and wanted someone to tell him they were valuable. Washburn had seen pretty rocks before. The Ozarks were full of them. He expected quartz pebbles and disappointment. Silas led him up the path without small talk, through the cave entrance with its new stone wall, past the main chamber with its cedar furniture and neatly stacked shelves, through the narrowing tunnels, past the baffles, through the squeeze point, and into the crystal chamber. Washburn stopped walking. He raised his lamp. The light caught the nearest cluster of dogtooth spar and exploded outward through the room in a cascade of reflected brilliance. Washburn was quiet for a very long time. "Good Lord," he said at last, and his voice had lost every trace of condescension. "Do you know what these are?" "Calcite," Silas said. "Dogtooth spar, I believe, mostly. Some of the violet ones toward the back might be amethystine quartz, but I'm not certain." Washburn turned and looked at him with the expression of a man who has just discovered that a dog can play chess. "You've been reading," he said. "I have a book." "One book?" "It's a good book." Washburn spent 3 hours in the crystal chamber. He measured formations with a tape, sketched crystal habits in his field notebook, chipped small samples with Silas's permission using tools from his leather case, held them up to the lamp and examined them through a hand lens, and talked continuously in a voice that had shifted from condescension to collegiality to something like unguarded excitement. The dogtooth spar formations, he told Silas, were among the finest he'd seen anywhere in the state, possibly the finest in the entire Ozark region. The crystal habit was exceptional, the clarity remarkable, the variety of included minerals unusual. The violet crystals were indeed amethystine quartz, rare in this geological context, and potentially quite valuable to mineral collectors, universities, and museums. But it was the cave's geothermal properties that truly astonished Washburn. He spent another hour in the main chamber, examining Silas's baffling system, holding his hand over the gaps to feel the airflow, pressing his palm against the stone walls to gauge temperature. "You say you've maintained 70 degrees through winter without fire?" he asked, and his tone was not skeptical but careful, the tone of a scientist who wants to make sure he's recording accurately. 71 last February, Silas said. 73 if I close the upper vent completely, but that makes the air too stale. That's remarkable. Washburn sat on one of Silas's cedar chairs and shook his head slowly. The thermal mass of this limestone, the depth of the formation, the natural convection currents, your management of the airflow. You've essentially built a passive heating system using principles that most architects in this country won't understand for another 50 years. You've been doing empirically what the theorists are only beginning to describe." Silas said nothing to that because he didn't know how to respond to praise he hadn't asked for. But Clara, standing behind them in the entrance with her arms folded, allowed herself a small, private smile. Washburn wrote a report for the state survey that mentioned the Pharaoh Cave and its unusual crystal formations and thermal properties. He also wrote a letter of introduction to a mineral dealer in St. Louis named Horace Greer, describing the specimens and their quality in terms that were, by Washburn's reserved standards, almost breathless. Greer wrote to Silas within the month, care of the Yellville post office, offering to buy crystal specimens at prices that made Silas read the letter 3 times to be sure he wasn't misunderstanding. A single cluster of clear dogtooth spar, properly extracted and prepared, could fetch between $5 and $15 depending on size and quality. The amethystine quartz was worth considerably more. A fine specimen might bring $30 or better. $30, nearly a year's wages for a farm laborer in Arkansas, for a single piece of stone. Silas did not rush to the crystal chamber with a hammer and a sack. That was not his way. He spent the entire winter of 1858 to 59 studying the formations more carefully than ever, returning to the chamber day after day with his lamp and his notebooks, identifying which crystal clusters were expendable, isolated formations that contributed little to the chamber's overall beauty, and which were integral, which were the anchoring pieces that gave the room its character. He mapped the growth patterns, noting which crystals were actively forming and which had reached equilibrium. He identified the fracture planes along which formations could be separated from the host rock without shattering. He made Clara help him build a set of extraction tools, thin-bladed chisels ground from old files, padded wooden wedges that could be tapped gently into fracture lines, a wire saw improvised from twisted steel that could cut through calcite matrix without transmitting the shock waves that would shatter delicate crystal points. Every technique he developed was guided by a single principle that he stated simply and never wavered from: take only what the cave could afford to give. The crystal chamber was not a mine. It was a living thing, still growing, still becoming, and he would harvest it the way a good farmer harvests an orchard, taking the fruit, never the tree. In March of 1859, he sent his first shipment to Horace Greer in St. Louis. 6 specimens of dogtooth spar and 2 clusters of amethystine quartz, each one wrapped in cotton batting. Clara had sewn into protective sleeves and packed in a wooden crate Silas had built himself, lined with sawdust, marked "fragile" in Clara's careful hand. Greer paid $97 for the lot by bank draft, which Silas had to walk to Harrison to cash because Yellville had no bank. $97. His brothers had given him 3. He did not go to Orrin's house to show him the money. He did not mention it to anyone in town. He bought lumber, good pine, planed and dried, and proper masonry tools and glass for windows, and a cast-iron cook stove with a pipe collar, bags of Portland cement and lime, hinges and nails, and a proper door lock, and hired a teamster with a mule wagon to haul it all up the creek road to the base of his bluff. And then he began to build in earnest. Not a shack, not a lean-to, not the rough survival shelter he'd been living in for 2.5 years. A proper stone house built into and around the mouth of the cave, using the bluff face as its back wall and the cave's interior as its foundation, incorporating the earth's warmth into every aspect of the design. Clara worked beside him every day, walking the 4 miles from her mother's homestead each morning and back each evening, her hands as calloused and capable as his own. Her masonry skills were, in important respects, superior to his. Her father had trained her in the Czech tradition of stone dressing, which produced tighter joints, more regular courses, and more beautiful finished surfaces than the rough stacking Silas had taught himself. She corrected his technique without condescension, and he accepted correction without pride. Together, over the spring and summer of 1859, they raised a 2-room house of dressed limestone with glass windows, a plank floor sealed with pine tar. The cast-iron stove vented through a chimney channel they carved into the rock face itself. A proper door of pine planks hung on iron hinges, and a front porch of flat stone that overlooked Sugar Creek from 100 feet up, with a view of the valley that stretched for miles in 3 directions. The cave behind the house served as pantry, workshop, root cellar, and, in the crystal chamber deep within, a source of steady income that asked nothing of them but patience and careful hands. They married on the 12th of October, 1859, in the front room of the stone house, with a circuit preacher from Harrison and 6 witnesses from the neighboring farms. Clara wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself from fabric bought with crystal money. Silas wore a clean shirt and a new pair of boots, and the expression of a man who has just realized that his life has turned a corner he didn't know was there, toward a country he didn't know existed. The years that followed were not easy. No years are, for anyone who lives honestly. But they were good. They were years with weight and substance to them, the kind of years you remember not for what happened, but for what you built. The crystal trade grew slowly and steadily, driven by Silas's refusal to overharvest, and by the increasing reputation of his specimens among collectors and institutions. Horace Greer sold Pharaoh Cave specimens to universities in St. Louis, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Washburn mentioned the cave in 2 published papers, bringing inquiries from geologists and mineralogists across the country. Silas began selling directly to universities and private collectors who wrote to him, always including his detailed notes on the geological context of each specimen, where it was found, its relationship to surrounding formations, the mineral composition, the estimated growth rate. His brown paper notebooks, now supplemented by proper bound journals bought in Harrison, became part of the product. Buyers valued them as scientific records. Clara bore 3 children in the stone house above Sugar Creek. The first, a boy named Antonine after her father, arrived in the summer of 1860. Clara's mother, Bojena, moved into the house to help, and the cave that had sheltered one lonely man now held 4 people, and felt warmer for it. Not in temperature, which the baffles still regulated with mechanical precision, but in the less measurable warmth of voices and laughter and the particular chaos of a baby waking in the night. The second child, a daughter they named Rose, came in the spring of 1862, the year the Civil War burned through northern Arkansas like a brush fire and left scars that would take a generation to heal. The war touched the Pharaohs only lightly. Silas was 34 by then, with a wife and children and a homestead so remote that neither Union foragers nor Confederate conscription parties thought it worth the climb. Bushwhackers raided the creek valley twice, but the bluff trail was steep and the cave invisible from below, and they passed on to easier targets. Silas did not fight. He continued to extract crystals with careful hands, tend the garden he terraced into the shelf of land below the bluff, and teach his children the names of rocks and trees and the habits of the creek in different seasons. The third child, another boy, named Emmett, was born in 1865, the year the war ended and the country tried, with uncertain steps, to remember what peace felt like. Through the 1860s and into the 1870s, Silas expanded the stone house room by room, always building into the bluff, always incorporating the cave's thermal properties into the design. He added a second story with a sleeping loft and a window that caught the morning sun. He built a stone-walled root cellar connected to one of the cave's side tunnels, where the constant 58-degree temperature kept vegetables fresh through the hottest summers and prevented freezing through the coldest winters. He carved a cistern into the limestone bedrock and channeled a spring into it through a stone-lined conduit, giving the house running water a decade before most homes in the county had anything but a well and a bucket. Visitors began to come. Not many at first. A geologist here, a mineral collector there, the occasional journalist from Little Rock or Memphis, drawn by Washburn's published accounts or Greer's word-of-mouth promotion among his dealer network. But word spread with the slow persistence of water finding its way through stone. By the mid-1870s, the Pharaoh Cave was something of a regional curiosity, a stone house built into a cliff by a self-taught naturalist, heated by the earth itself, its interior walls glittering with calcite in the lamplight, its deep chambers holding crystal formations that glowed like something from a fairy tale. Silas charged nothing for tours. He simply showed people what the cave had shown him, leading them through the chambers and tunnels with his lamp held high, explaining the geology, the thermal principles, the crystal formations, the behavior of the underground water, with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 20 years paying close attention to one place and understood it the way a parent understands a child. The visitors brought money, not directly, but through increased demand for specimens, through mentions in scientific journals and travel accounts, through the slow, compounding accumulation of reputation. By 1880, Silas Pharaoh was not a rich man by any Eastern standard, but by the standards of the Arkansas Ozarks he was prosperous. More importantly, he was respected. The same townspeople who had pitied him or mocked him 24 years before now brought their children to see the cave and asked his advice on laying foundations and reading weather signs and understanding why springs ran high in some years and low in others. He gave the advice freely. He never mentioned the mockery. He never reminded anyone of what they'd said about the badger in the hole. There was no need. Success, quietly achieved, speaks in a language that doesn't require translation. Orrin Pharaoh died in the winter of 1877 at 52 years of age, worn out by decades of hard farming on land that had never been as fertile as he'd believed, and a marriage that had sourced long before it finally ended. The 40 acres their father had left him were mortgaged twice over, the soil exhausted by tobacco and corn planted year after year without rotation or rest. Letitia had left him in 1871, taking what she could carry and what she could sell, and going back to her family in Missouri. She took no memories of Yellville with her. Gerald, the middle brother, had sold his share of the farm in 1868 for a fraction of its worth and gone west to Kansas, where he disappeared into the anonymity of the plains and the vast indifference of a country that was moving too fast to keep track of everyone. No one in Yellville heard from him again. Silas received the news of Orrin's death from the postmaster on a cold December afternoon. He walked home in the early dark, climbed the bluff trail, entered the warm cave, and sat on his porch, enclosed now with glass windows for winter, looking out over the valley for a long time. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not feel the vindication that some part of him, the part that was still 28 and standing in the yard holding a canvas sack, might have expected to feel. What he felt, if he was honest with himself, was a kind of sorrow. Not for the man Orrin had been, but for the man Orrin might have been, if something in his character or his circumstances had allowed him to look at the world with curiosity instead of greed, with attention instead of acquisitiveness. Orrin had inherited the better land, the house, the tools, the livestock, the family name's weight in the community, and it had all come to nothing. Silas had inherited $3 and a cracked hand plane, and it had come to this: warmth, family, purpose, the slow accumulation of a life well built. The difference wasn't luck, it was sight. Orrin had looked at the world and seen only what he could take from it. Silas had looked at the world and seen what it was willing to teach. He walked to Yellville the next day and paid for his brother's burial from his own pocket. He bought a decent headstone of local limestone. He did not attend the funeral, because funerals are for the living, and there was no one living who would have wanted him there. The children grew, as children do, into people their parents could not have predicted and could not entirely take credit for. Antonine, the eldest, inherited his grandfather Marek's gift for stonework and his father's patience. He was a big, quiet boy who preferred building to talking and who could dress a stone face at 14 with the precision of a journeyman twice his age. He became a builder, constructing houses and public buildings throughout the Ozark region with a reputation for work that lasted, foundations that didn't crack, walls that didn't lean, chimneys that drew true. He married a school teacher from Harrison named Abigail and settled on a piece of land 2 miles down Sugar Creek, close enough to visit the cave house every Sunday for dinner and to help his aging father with the heavier work of crystal extraction. Rose took after her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's love of books, combining them into something neither parent had quite imagined. She attended the Arkansas Industrial University in Fayetteville, one of the first women to do so, and the only one in her year who studied natural science, and graduated with honors in 1884. She would go on to teach geology and natural history at a women's college in Virginia, carrying her father's journals with her as both scientific reference and personal talisman. She published 3 papers on Ozark mineral formations, citing her father's observations extensively, and became known in academic circles as a rigorous field geologist with an unusual gift for making stone interesting to people who had never thought about it. Emmett, the youngest, was the dreamer, or rather, the one who dreamed in a language his parents couldn't entirely speak but recognized and honored. He loved the cave with an intensity that sometimes worried Clara and always delighted Silas. From the age of 6, he spent hours in the crystal chamber, lying on his back on the cold stone floor, watching the way lamplight moved through the formations, how a single flame could become 1,000 flames in the facets of a calcite cluster. He drew them endlessly, first with charcoal on scraps of brown paper, then with pencils and proper sketch pads, then with watercolors that captured the translucency and fire of the crystals in ways that words could not. At 17, he left for St. Louis to study art. He spent his career painting the landscapes and underground wonders of the American interior: caves, mines, crystal chambers, underground rivers, with a luminous, almost mystical quality that made viewers feel they were seeing not just rock and mineral, but something alive and ancient and holy. His most famous work, Cathedral of Crystal, a monumental canvas depicting the interior of his father's cave, hung for decades in the St. Louis Art Museum and was reproduced in 3 geology textbooks. It showed the chamber as Emmett had first seen it as a boy, vast, glittering, lit from within by a light that seemed to come from the stone itself. Silas watched his children become themselves with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understands that his real wealth is not in the ground, but walking around on top of it. Clara died in the winter of 1889. She was 55 years old. A fever took her quickly. 3 days from the first chill to the last breath, despite every remedy the doctor from Harrison could offer, and every prayer her mother Bojana could whisper in check. Silas held her hand in the stone house she'd helped build, in the room where they'd been married 30 years before, and he did not look away. She died in the early morning, with weak winter light coming through the glass windows she'd wanted and he'd installed, and the cave breathing warm air behind the walls the way it always did, steady and patient and utterly indifferent to grief. She was buried on the shelf of land below the bluff in a plot overlooking Sugar Creek, with a headstone that Antonin carved from a single block of the same dense, fine-grained limestone that made up the cave walls. The inscription was simple: Clara Merrick Farrow, 1834 to 1889. She knew how to read stone. Bojana survived her daughter by 2 years, dying peacefully in the cave house in 1891, surrounded by grandchildren who spoke English with Czech endearments mixed in. Silas grieved, but he did not stop. He was 61 years old, white-haired and lean, and still strong enough to climb the bluff trail without pausing, and the cave still needed tending, and the crystals still grew in the dark, and his grandchildren, Antonine had 3 by then, Rose had 2, needed to learn what he knew. He kept working, he kept observing, he kept writing in his journals, which now filled an entire shelf he'd carved into the cave wall. Decades of patient observation bound in leather and stacked in chronological order, a library of attention. In the spring of 1890, a young geologist from the newly established Arkansas Geological Survey came to study the cave. His name was Thomas Breckenridge, and he was 26 years old and bristling with university education and modern instruments. He brought thermometers calibrated in both Fahrenheit and Celsius, a mercury barometer, a surveyor's compass, a transit level, and something Silas had never seen: a camera, a bulky wooden apparatus that required a tripod and glass plates, and an elaborate chemical process to produce a single image. Breckenridge spent a week at the cave, measuring everything that could be measured, and photographing everything that would hold still long enough. He confirmed what Silas had observed and recorded for 34 years. The cave maintained a year-round temperature between 56 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit in its deeper passages, modulated by natural convection and the thermal mass of the surrounding limestone. The main living chamber, with Silas's baffling system intact and refined over 3 decades, held steady between 68 and 73 degrees, depending on the season and the configuration of the vents. The crystal chamber's formations were, in Breckenridge's professional assessment, of exceptional quality and scientific significance. Breckenridge measured it all, wrote it all down in a notebook considerably more expensive than Silas's original brown paper, and then sat on the stone porch in the spring evening and told Silas something that made the old man's weathered face break into a rare, wide smile. "Mr. Farrow," Breckenridge said, choosing his words with the care of a man addressing someone he has come to respect profoundly. "You've been practicing what we're now calling passive solar and geothermal design. The principles you've worked out through observation and experiment: thermal mass regulation, convective airflow management, natural insulation, seasonal ventilation adjustment. These are the same principles that the most advanced architects and engineers in Europe are just beginning to explore in formal, theoretical terms. You were 30 years ahead of your time, sir, possibly more." Silas rocked in his chair, a cedar rocker he'd built in the winter of 1870, still solid, still comfortable, and looked out over the valley. The dogwoods were blooming again. They always did, year after year, patient and faithful and entirely unconcerned with human opinions about timing. "I wasn't ahead of anything," he said. "The cave was already doing it, had been doing it for 100,000 years before I showed up. I just paid attention." Breckenridge photographed the cave, the crystal chamber, the stone house, and Silas himself, a lean, white-bearded man in a clean shirt, standing in the mouth of the cave, with one hand resting on the limestone wall, the way a man rests his hand on the shoulder of an old friend. That photograph would be reprinted in 3 geological publications and 2 popular magazines over the following decade. It showed a man who looked entirely at home in the only place that had ever been truly his. Silas Farrow spent his final years in the stone house above Sugar Creek, tending his garden on the terrace below the bluff, writing his observations in journals that grew more reflective as the years passed, and teaching his grandchildren what the cave had taught him. He was not lonely. Antonin's family was close. Rose visited every summer with her children, filling the house with the noise and clutter that Silas pretended to find tiresome and secretly cherished. Emmett came when he could, always with his sketchbook, always drawn back to the crystal chamber like a compass needle finding north. On clear evenings, when the light was fading and the valley filled with blue shadow, Silas would walk to the back of the cave and stand in the crystal room with a single lamp. The formations had not changed perceptibly in nearly 40 years. They would not change perceptibly in another 400. That was the lesson, he told his grandchildren, that some things were built to last beyond any human measure, and the only proper response to that kind of patience was more patience, more attention, more willingness to look and look again. There's always more to find, he told his eldest grandson, Antonin's boy James, on a winter evening in 1893. They were sitting in the crystal chamber, the boy cross-legged on the stone floor, Silas in a chair he'd placed there years ago for exactly this purpose. James was 10 years old, bright-eyed and serious, and he already knew the cave's tunnels better than most grown adults. The lamp threw moving light across the formations, and the crystals caught it and passed it on, point to point, facet to facet, as they had for longer than anyone could count. Every time you think you've seen everything, Silas said, you look again and there's more. A crystal you didn't notice, a color you didn't see, a pattern you weren't ready to understand. That's true of caves, James. That's true of people. That's true of everything worth knowing. The boy nodded, and Silas could see in his face the same quality he'd recognized in Clara 35 years before. The quality of attention, of willingness to look carefully at what was actually there. Some things, it seemed, could be passed on. Silas Farrow died on the 14th of March, 1894, at the age of 66. He died in the stone house he and Clara had built together, in the cedar bed he'd made with his own hands in the first year of their marriage, in a room that held steady at 70 degrees, while a late-season snowstorm howled outside and coated the valley in white. His 3 children were with him. His grandchildren were in the next room, hushed and wide-eyed, understanding that something important was happening behind the closed door. His last words, according to Rose, who wrote them down in one of his journals in her careful academic hand, were, "Listen to the stone. It knows more than we do." He was buried beside Clara, on the shelf of land above Sugar Creek, where the morning sun hit early and the view stretched to the distant ridgeline. Antonin carved his headstone from the same cave limestone as his mother's, and placed it so the 2 stones leaned very slightly toward each other. The inscription read, Silas Farrow, 1828 to 1894. He listened. The stone house stood for another 80 years. Antonin maintained it, and then James after him, and then James's daughter Margaret after that. Each generation added something, a room, a window, a better path up the bluff, a pump for the cistern. But the core of the structure, the original dressed limestone walls that Silas and Clara had raised together in the spring and summer of 1859, never needed repair. Clara's mortar held. The stone held. The cave behind the walls held its warmth through every winter, cool through every summer, steady as the heartbeat of the earth itself. The crystal chamber was never exhausted. Silas's policy of careful, limited extraction, take only what the cave can afford to give, meant that the formations continued to grow, slowly and silently, replenishing themselves in the deep time of geology, a time measured not in years or generations, but in the accumulation of molecules, one upon the next, patient beyond all human understanding. Specimens from the Pharaoh Cave can still be found in university mineral collections across the country, each one labeled in Silas's careful hand or in Rose's more elegant script, accompanied by notes on provenance and context that modern geologists still cite. In 1937, a section of the cave, including the crystal chamber, was designated a state natural area, protected by law from commercial mining and unrestricted access. In 1962, the Arkansas Geological Survey published a monograph on the cave's geothermal properties, citing Silas's journals, by then preserved in the University of Arkansas Special Collections Library, as the earliest known systematic observations of passive geothermal temperature regulation in a residential context in the state. The monograph noted that Silas's baffling system, designed by trial and error in the desperate winter of 1856, anticipated principles of earth-sheltered architecture that would not be formally described in academic literature until the 1970s. The stone house eventually fell into disrepair after the last of the direct Pharaoh descendants moved away in the late 1970s. The roof gave way first, then the plank floors, then the glass windows. But the stone walls stood and stand still, the mortar Clara mixed holding firm after more than a century and a half. The cave behind them has not changed. The crystals remain. They catch whatever light finds its way in. Sunlight through the open doorway, moonlight on clear nights, the occasional flashlight of a hiker who has heard the story and climbed the bluff to see for himself. They throw the light back the way they always have, point to point, facet to facet, a slow-motion firework that has been detonating for 100,000 years and shows no sign of stopping. The temperature in the deep chambers still holds steady at 57 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, whether the world above is burning with summer or locked in ice. The cave breathes. It has always breathed. It will breathe long after the last human who remembers Silas Pharaoh's name has gone. Surviving is building. That is what the cave taught him, and what he taught his children, and what his children carried into the world in their different ways, in stone and scholarship and paint, and the quiet conviction that the things worth having are the things you build yourself, slowly, with patience and attention, and the willingness to keep looking when everyone else has turned away. And deep in the hillside above Sugar Creek, in a chamber no bigger than a church, the crystals go on growing, drop by drop, year by year, patient as the man who found them, patient as the stone that holds them, waiting, as they always have, for someone willing to look closely enough to see what's really there.